Good afternoon and welcome to the NV5 Geospatial presentation of remote sensing and analyses to support hydrospatial solutions. Big thanks to the GeoIgnite organizers who have helped us get coordinated for this event. I'm Sven Cowan and I'm the Canada Program Manager for NV5 Geospatial, and I'm based here in Vancouver, BC. Joining us shortly will be Mischa. He is the Analytics Practice Lead at NV5 Geospatial, and he is based in Corvallis, Oregon. I'm going to start today by giving a bit of an overview about NV5 Geospatial and some of the work that we do, and then Mischa will take over from there. So NV5 Geospatial might be a new company name to some of you, but we've probably also worked with some of you previously under our previous company name, which was Quantum Spatial Canada. But we've done some rebranding. We're now part of the broader NV5 Corporation, and we are doing business as NV5 Geospatial. We're about 600 professionals. We're located in 10 office locations across the US and Canada, and we have quite a bit of history in the space. Our heritage goes back to 1922, and we started doing aerial imagery surveys. Every year, we do work across the continent in every US state and Canada, so we're able to mobilize our assets as needed to support our project work. And at NV5 Geospatial, we have a saying that everything starts with good data, and that governs just about everything we do. Based on our capabilities, we are focused on a few core markets. With wide area mapping, specifically for Lidar, we do quite a bit of work in this area, and we're a major contributor to the 3D elevation program in the US. For forestry, we've developed a lot of unique analytics, ray tracing Lidar and co-acquired imagery, which can be used for individual tree segmentation and species identification. Utilities is also a big area of focus for us, whether it is a vegetation management program across a series of transmission lines, or looking more closely at a distribution system and an asset management program with a mobile mapping unit. We're able to support a lot of those utility-focused applications. But here today, we're going to talk about our hydrospatial solutions. We have been a pioneer in this space, and this is a lot of the work that we do here at NV5 Geospatial. So last year we added Geodynamics to our portfolio. Geodynamics is a hydro survey firm based on the East Coast, and now we have the ability to do all of our terrestrial survey that we talked about using our fixed wing and rotary wing systems and our UAS platforms. We're able to do nearshore bathymetry with our Topobathymetric Lidar systems, and now we can do shallow and deep water surveys using single, multi-beam, and side-scan sonar with our addition of Geodynamics. For Topobathymetric Lidar, we have done a number of different surveys across Canada. We have surveyed close to 50 rivers and lakes with Topobathymetric Lidar. We've done the 7 largest Okanagan lakes here in BC. We recently did a project for the Bow and Elbow rivers in the city of Calgary. Also done a large project in the South Saskatchewan River in Saskatchewan. Last year, some of you might remember, we presented at GeoIgnite with the City of Montreal for a major topobathymetric survey we did in the city there. And we've surveyed a number of other rivers within the province of Quebec. Next week, we're going to be holding a workshop that will be focused just on Topobathymetric Lidar. And this will be a great opportunity for anyone who's been interested in the technology or might be considering a project. We'll have a panel of experts, so we'll be talking about what the technology is, which sensors we use, how we handle flight planning and the ground survey. We'll be getting into some point clouds and derived products, so we'll be able to show the nuts and bolts of the data we actually deliver. And Mischa will also be a part of the workshop next week, taking a much deeper dive into some of the applications that Topobathymetric Lidar supports. So the workshop will be on March 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and we hope that anyone who's interested can join us for that workshop. It will be free to attend. So shifting gears into our presentation for today, the theme of GeoIgnite 2022 is climate change, and this is definitely relevant for our presentation topic. Here is a satellite image of Vancouver taken during the major flooding that we experienced in the lower mainland a few months ago. You can see the city of Vancouver in the middle of the image, and the Fraser River, which is swollen and overflowing with debris, dumping tons of material into the Strait of Georgia. The United Nations Water Agency states that water is the primary medium through which we will all feel the effects of climate change, either through extreme absence or excess. And last year in BC, we experienced both. First, we had massive heat waves that set a new national temperature record and also created dangerously dry conditions that then led to one of the largest wildfire seasons we've had. A few months after that, we experienced the atmospheric river phenomenon that dumped a month's worth of rain over only 2 days across the region. This caused these huge floods in lower BC that we're really still recovering from, and that will likely be the most costly severe weather event in BC history. So climate change left a big mark on us in BC last year, and the trends in temperature and precipitation are expected to cause more severe weather that will affect more of us in the future, all through the medium of water. So the ability to be able to detect, map, and understand water is one of the core strengths of NV5 Geospatial. I've already talked a little bit about our capability in this area, but this is going to be the focus for the remainder of our presentation today. Our technology and experience for mapping water and supporting hydrospatial solutions can help to better understand the impacts and manage the risk from the effects of climate change. So now with that, I'll turn things over to Mischa Hay for the remainder of the presentation. Again, Mischa is the Analytics Practice Lead for us here at NV5 Geospatial. Thanks a lot for your interest in this topic and for your attendance of our presentation.
Hi, my name is Mischa Hay. I'm the Analytics Practice Lead with NV5 Geospatial, and today I'm going to be talking about remote sensing and analyses to support hydrospatial solutions. I'm going to try to turn my camera off for the rest of this so that I don't obstruct the slides. Some of the things I'm going to be talking about today are acquisition technologies, including Lidar, Topobathymetric Lidar, sonar, thermal infrared imagery. Going to discuss the data integration and analysis and how that can improve the utility and efficiency and objectivity of the data sets. We're going to cover some application examples, including the source, transport, storage, and use of water, as well as how some of this data supports inundation modeling, habitat, and maybe a couple others. And then why I'm giving a presentation like this is this stuff is really expensive, and the goal is to get the most out of it. So we found that vertical integration of the data processing stream can really maximize the utility for a number of applications and allows us to customize each step or in the source data processing to really achieve the best answer. Fair warning, I'm going to be about an inch deep on all of this stuff. As Sven mentioned, we're giving a much longer workshop on March 9th, and anybody who is interested is encouraged to attend, and we can really dive into a lot more detail. So the first acquisition technology I'm going to talk about is Topobathymetric Lidar. It's a 2 wavelength system. One shoots in the near IR wavelength and is absorbed by water, while the green or bathymetric waveform is in the green wavelength and can actually penetrate water. Pretty much the same principle, super fancy laser rangefinder, bounces off stuff, comes back to the plane. Here is an example of a mountain headwater pool. The red is representing the terrestrial or NIR wavelength, and the green would be the extra detail underwater that you get from the bathymetric system. This is just another example of a coastal river. Here's a true color ortho. Here is a false color ortho with all the vegetation highlighted in red. This is the bathymetric representation of a hillshade, or a hillshade representation of the bathymetric coverage underneath the water. And you can start to look at that for depth and elevation. Topobathymetric Lidar does not work everywhere. Highly aerated water, turbid water, areas with heavy aquatic vegetation. Essentially, we're shooting light. And so if you can't see through it, if the light can't get through it, then we're not going to map through it. And that's where sonar comes in. So this is a picture of a section of the Klamath River. They're doing a huge dam removal project, removing 4 dams along the Klamath River. We flew the whole thing with Topobathymetric Lidar. This is what that coverage looks like. So you can see we missed some pools and a couple riffles where it was too deep or too aerated to get a good sounding on the bottom. And this is the first part of the data integration, is by then deploying a multi-beam sonar and a jet boat, we're able to fill in all of those gaps with far less effort than mapping the entire river with the sonar. And if everything is collected right, you can see there it blends quite seamlessly to get a full topobathymetric coverage of the river bottom. Other data that we like to integrate are imagery. So this is just a true color representation, but it can be done with a 4-band image as well. We have a particular approach to doing this to eliminate tree lean and maximize the co-registration between the Lidar and the spectra to allow us to utilize both of those data sets in any kind of subsequent analyses. Here is a quick graphic on what that colorization process looks like. Forgive its blurriness. On the left, this is a representation of 2 Lidar flight lines shooting at trees. And on the right, associated imagery flight lines shooting at the same stand. Our process traces the origin point of each Lidar pulse back to the plane so that we can appropriately select the image and thus pixel from which to colorize. But there's not just RGB imagery. There's fancy kinds of imagery like hyperspectral, which divides the spectral range up into very narrow discrete bands, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 nanometers, depending on what sensors and specifications you're flying. Hyperspectral imagery can actually be used to directly map depth of water based on band attenuation, and then is very useful when you're trying to distinguish vegetation species for habitat or carbon or invasives or anything along those lines. And then another big aquatic application for imagery is the thermal infrared, which records temperature in the long wave infrared. We use ground deployed sensors to calibrate this imagery. It can be really helpful for habitat or pollution monitoring if you're looking for point source pollution or groundwater influxes to the river system, or thermal refugia for fisheries species, anything along those lines. So the first kind of applications I'm going to start diving into is what I'm calling the anthrocentric water cycle. And I realize anthrocentric is not a word, but I figure if we're allowed to say things like hydrospatial, then I can say things like anthrocentric. And what this is an approach to map the source of water for human use, the transport of water, the storage of water, and the use of water. A little GIF representation of what I'm talking about. So in the upper left, rain falls as snow or rain. It is then allocated across the landscape into basins at whatever scales the application is, whatever scales are relevant to the application. Then flows through surface transport paths called rivers and streams into ponds and reservoirs. Gets used by people as either irrigation or indoor water use, then flows back into either rivers and streams or a stormwater network, and eventually becomes precipitation again. So the source component of this, and the first source component of this, is some work we're doing with the Airborne Snow Observatories, Inc. They are mapping snowpack in close to real time using hyperspectral imagery and Lidar. They're doing it over entire mountain ranges, which can be incredibly useful for any water manager or dam operator trying to do irrigation budgets for the Central Valley in California or wherever water is in any water limited geography. This program is rapidly expanding and has some real advantages over previous approaches to understanding snowpack. Once the snow or rain falls, it is allocated into basins. So hydrologic units or basins delineated from high-resolution Lidar elevation models. These can be done really at any scale relevant to the question. So every individual reach can have its own basin, or you can look at much broader range-wide allocation units. This is just a representation of the hydrologic units as defined by the watershed boundary data set. So a HUC-12 is a large watershed, which is then divided up into a bunch of HUC-14s and HUC-16s, and you can see that the sheer number of these things grows exponentially as you drop in scale. The next part, so we've covered source, we've allocated it, and now we're going to map it across the landscape in surface flow paths. The US version of this is the National Hydrography Dataset. The Canadian version of this is a National Hydrographic Network. They are largely designed to represent the same thing. This is basically a delineation of ponds, lakes, rivers, streams, and coastal waters. One component of the sort of surface hydrology that is not particularly well represented by either of these data sets is wetland inclusion. We're doing a lot of work right now with USGS and others to figure out how to integrate wetlands inventory with the NHD or the NHN in Canada to really give a comprehensive picture of surface hydrology. And this has applications for inundation modeling, habitat, land use planning, anything along those lines. But in an urban environment, the surface transport is not the primary hydrologic driver. And so as we start to think about inundation in cities and pollution tracking and management, integrating a subsurface network or a stormwater network is really essential to giving a good understanding of how water moves in an urban landscape. This is not stuff that we can map through remote sensing. It needs to be previously captured by the municipality or whoever manages the stormwater network. But if it's well mapped, we can create a nice integrated picture of when water goes underground, where it comes out, and even generate sort of sewer sheds or basins, again, an allocation of that water from surface to the ground strictly based on the network and the terrain. So we've mapped the source, we've started to move the water across the landscape or understand where it's going, but that water all gets stored in reservoirs or ponds and lakes. And so a clear bathymetric picture of that reservoir, pond, or lake allows us to understand the volume in that lake very rapidly. So once you have a well-mapped reservoir, let's say, the actual volumetric computation can be essentially a single reading of the water level, and you know how much water you have on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis in the reservoir. And so if you're trying to monitor flows for either inundation or irrigation, budgeting, or minimum flows for fisheries, anything along those lines, this can be really valuable information. Last component we're going to talk about is use. So we've done source, transport, storage, and then understanding how much water people are using and what they're using it for is kind of the last component to this question. And so this is just an example of some irrigated vegetation mapping that we're doing for the state of California. You can see we get into a pretty detailed classification system because the signatures of these types of data are really quite variable and rely very heavily on context. So a piece of dirt in one area might not be the same land use as a piece of dirt in another area. And so we break it out into a very detailed classification and then collapse those into irrigable, non-irrigated, and irrigated land. That data can be summarized at a water district or municipality or a basin or a parcel, whatever we're kind of interested in. So a clear understanding of the use or projected use of water within within any location can be quantified and assessed against actual water metering or end uses as determined by the water district. So what else can we do with this data? Talked about, we have this really high resolution integrated terrestrial elevation and bathymetric model. As you can imagine, that would feed directly into some of the inundation modeling interest, particularly with climate change, changing that inundation paradigm. As you start associating the land cover, you're getting infrastructure mapping kind of inherent in the road and building network, so you'll understand what's at risk. I think that utilizing this information to inform the impediments and roughness coefficients is potentially going to improve the accuracy of the H&H or the inundation models, and gives an immediate picture of at-risk structures and areas. The last thing I didn't touch on is, because we're flying this and mapping the wetted extent while we do it, you get an immediate model calibration for that time and flow of acquisition, assuming there's a gauge or something that you can use to understand how much water is moving through the system at the time. The last topic I want to talk about today is how this information can be used for riverine habitat restoration and monitoring. So you can picture that we now have comprehensive, highly accurate coverage in both the bathymetric and terrestrial terrain. And then we have a bunch of above ground information from the Lidar. And so classifying the bathymetry in-channel and off-channel habitat into geomorphic units is really just an analytical exercise that can feed into sort of expert interpretation. Large woody debris, you can see there in the red and purple graphic, can be mapped directly from the Lidar point cloud. Channel characteristics such as confinement, meander, and complexity can be rapidly identified. Relative elevation models allow for a quick and dirty understanding of connectivity of off-channel habitat, even without doing the full flood inundation modeling, the H&H modeling. And then the imagery, the thermal infrared imagery, as we talked about, can be combined with shade modeling, actually tracking the path of the sun to get a better understanding of the solar inputs throughout the river channel. This is just a kind of integrated graphic that shows a bunch of analytics and a bunch of data together. So this is a colorized point cloud. Shows a little individual tree delineation there. Classified to fir, gives you some height, crown diameter, and DBH information. We can say that it's healthy due to the analysis of NDVI. In the lower left there, you can see a bathymetric cross-section showing the water surface. As we move over to the right, you can see how the temperature gradient actually changes throughout the river, and then you can look at the solar exposure of a particular location, what geomorphic unit that might be classed into, look at the depth and the temperature resulting from that. So it's really creating a full suite of analytics and a much more comprehensive understanding of a system around a river. So in summary, remote sensing technology and analytics can provide valuable information to water resource managers. Cloud compute and advanced analytics reduce labor and time, making these solutions actually viable market offerings at really large scales. And right now, each of these components kind of exists in isolation. People look at source, they look at transport, storage, use, inundation, habitat, but they're not integrating the whole picture. And without remote sensing, that's really hard to do at a very broad scale. So our hope is that these solutions can start creating a more holistic understanding of water in our world for anything we want to do with water. So with that, I open it to questions, comments, ideas. Again, my name is Mischa Hay, Analytics Practice Lead, and Sven Cowan, the Canada Program Manager. Our contact info is right there. Thank you.
So great presentation, NV5 Geospatial. Welcome back. Love to have you. See you here again. Silver sponsor for GeoIgnite. You guys made a big splash last year with the Montreal presentation. It was fantastic. You had some amazing looking data there. I don't think, I used to do some Lidar work many years ago, and that's the most impressive kind of integrations I've seen in a very long time. So congrats on that. Before I interrupted, we were going to dive into the Q&A. We have about 5 minutes for that. So let's start maybe with the first one from Dragos. Was this hydrographic and topobathymetric data collected by NV5, or does it come from external sources?
Yeah, this is all our data. Everything you looked at. We have a large array of both sensors and aerial platforms.
Excellent. Another question that's come in. Can these data, LiDAR and imagery, be co-acquired at the same time?
In theory, yes. There are some logistical constraints to that. So really depends on the scale of the project, but the acquisition windows are different depending on if you're flying LiDAR or thermal imagery. The footprints and resolutions of the sensors will vary based on flying height. So it's really it's possible. It just doesn't always make sense to collect everything at the same time. It can be more costly. And so that's part of why we dove very deeply into how to integrate this, even if it's not all co-acquired.
Excellent, thank you. Another question, can you elaborate on how elevation-derived hydrography network can support both 1D and 2D inundation modeling?
Sure. One of the byproducts of the elevation-derived hydrography process is a hydro-enforced elevation model. So we've breached all of the false obstructions like culverts going through roads, things along those lines. And when you tie sort of that with some of the land cover stuff that we looked at, that becomes really the inputs for a 2D model. And then for 1D modeling, you can start with the center lines or the channel lines, and then develop transects through automated fashion in the geometry. Again, associate the land cover and LiDAR information to get roughness for that. And it quickly builds the geometric inputs for either 1 or 2D inundation modeling.
Cool, thank you. Question on climate change and NV5's work. How do the NV5 geospatial hydrospatial solutions address climate change? Pretty big question.
Yeah, I'll take a swing at that one. Thanks, John. I mean, I feel like the last slide Mischa had in the presentation, sums it up, right? Our solutions really hope to allow a more holistic understanding of water in our world. And we're not saying we're going to solve climate change, but we are saying we're going to definitely help to map, understand, and detect water and mitigate the risks associated with climate change. And that's what our hydrospatial solutions are focused on.
Fantastic. I see we have Denny Haynes is asking a question. Denny is a global hydrospatial evangelist, if I may name him such. He says, he missed your presentation. Can you define the scope of hydrospatial in your context?
Yeah, hydrospatial is a word I struggle with. It's kind of like terraspatial in my mind. It's really all things water and mapping all things water. We do a lot of deep water sonar work with one of our recently acquired groups called Geodynamics. Mapping irrigated vegetation might be considered a stretch in hydrospatial in the context of hydrospatial, but it's an all-encompassing term to understand water, both transport, use, and all associated components of that.
Great, thank you. A question from Paul. Paul says, thank you for your presentation. What could be the implication of using LiDAR in irrigation systems? What could be the advantages of using LiDAR for water management and agriculture?
LiDAR in irrigation systems, if it's not sitting above the ground, we're not going to see it. So I'm not sure exactly how well LiDAR is going to factor into the actual irrigation systems as far as the drainage or availability of water. LiDAR can tell you a lot about where that is and where it will be allocated. But I think for agriculture, the real advantages are more going to be on the spectral side of things. We can certainly do a structural growth as far as volume of agriculture, but I think that the health or the precision ag side of things is going to be far more supported by the spectral analysis and spectral data collects.
Fantastic. A question's come in from Colleen. She says, incredible presentation and work. You spoke about estimating water storage capacity of lakes and ponds. Have you been looking for ways to quantify wetland volume, i.e. a bog where a vegetation mat floats on water for water storage estimation? Thank you.
Have we been looking at it? Yes. Have I solved that problem? No. Often wetlands are too shallow to really deploy sonar in, and so truly mapping the bathymetry of wetlands gets difficult. There are terrain analyses like a topographic wetland or wetness index, and some satellite solutions like STAR to look at soil content or soil moisture content, but really turning that into a volumetric picture of the wetland, I don't know that nut has been fully cracked.
Thank you very much. So you've got a workshop coming up. You mentioned it in your presentation. We're inside our break now, so I'd like to give a chance just to preview that again a little bit. It's called NV5 Geospatial Topobathymetric Lidar Solutions and Applications, March 9th. Who should be at that workshop?
I would say definitely anyone who's interested in the technology or who might be considering a project is encouraged to attend. There's the great presentation from Natural Resources Canada earlier today talking about some of the new programs related to flood mapping across Canada. And I think if there's any provincial or municipal groups that might be considering a program or a project as part of that program, this would be a great opportunity to learn a lot more from a panel of subject matter experts about what sensors we use, how the technology actually works, how we process the data. We'll get into some point clouds to really show off what we deliver. Mischa will be a part of that to take a deeper dive into the applications. And yeah, it's going to be a 3-hour workshop. We'll take a much deeper dive into this topic there, and anyone who's interested is encouraged to attend.
Fantastic. Anything you wanted to close on before we go to the break?
Just to say we're happy to be here. Really pleased. This is our 3rd year as part of GeoIgnite, and so really appreciate all the organization of this event, and happy to be here to support GeoIgnite and the Canadian geospatial community.
And thank you, Sven. We really appreciate the support. It's that support that allows us to keep this open and free for the entire community. Thank you.